Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the California ISO, I'd like to welcome you to the Subscriber Participating Transmission Owner Model meeting to discuss the draft final proposal. My name is Caitlin McGee, representing the Stakeholder Affairs Group here at the ISO, and I'll be facilitating today's meeting. I'm also joined by Deb Levine, Director of Infrastructure Contracts and Management. As a reminder, the presentation and agenda for this meeting can be found on the Policy Initiatives webpage under the Stay Informed tab. Next slide, please. Before we get started today, a few housekeeping reminders. This call is being recorded for informational and convenience purposes only. Any related transcriptions should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. We do try to structure these meetings in a way to stimulate dialogue and engage different perspectives. However, we do ask that you please keep your comments professional and respectful, and try to refrain from repeating what has already been said. Next slide, please. There are a few ways to ask questions today during today's call. If you're connected through the WebEx platform using the Call Me option, you can select the raise hand icon, which is located in the bottom right above the chat window. You can also type your question into the chat window and send that to myself or all panelists. And then if you're connected through an audio-only line, you can press the #2 to add yourself to the queue. When you are asking questions, please remember to state your name and affiliation before making your comment or question. If you do need technical assistance today during the meeting, you can send a chat to the event producer. Next slide, please. So before we get started, here's a quick overview of CAISO's policy initiative stakeholder process. As you can see, we've already put out the straw proposal, and we're here talking about the draft final proposal today. Next slide, please. So with that, I'll hand it over to Deb to talk about the SPTO draft final proposal.
All right, thank you so much, Caitlin. So today, the different topics we've got for the subscriber PTO model is the development of the model itself and why we're doing it, the use of encumbrances, transmission costs, including the subscriber wheeling charge, which is the non-subscriber use of the SPTO transmission facilities. There were a number of questions that came out of the straw proposal regarding future network upgrades, so I broke that out separately along with termination of the subscriber encumbrance. We'll also talk about the transmission cost allocation, generator interconnection and transmission planning process, and deliverability. Next slide, please. So the reason for development of a subscriber PTO is that we're looking for a different way for developers to be able to develop transmission projects and with generation outside of the transmission planning process. This is consistent with what FERC has already approved as a subscriber-funded transmission approach, and it will give California the opportunity to allow out-of-state resources to be within the ISOBA and deliver generation to California as we evolve, consistent with our renewable portfolio standards for the future. The concept of developing a subscriber PTO was supported significantly by the people who commented on the straw proposal. Next slide, please. So the first portion of the subscriber PTO is, since the entity that is the subscriber, the subscriber PTO who's going to be building the transmission facilities is not going to be incorporating their transmission revenue requirements in the ISO's tax. So in order to compensate them for building the line, and bringing the generation of their project to California to meet our standards. And it's been decided that we'll go ahead and use the encumbrance mechanism. And that's the exact same mechanism that is being planned to be used for EDAM, for each one of the EDAM balancing authority areas that have transmission contracts. They'll go ahead and have an encumbrance based on the transmission contracts that they have, and will be used and settled the same way that we're proposing to do it with a subscriber PTO. A number of people supported the use of encumbrances, but there were also a number of people that had additional questions regarding, you know, can we have a better delineation of the rights and obligations of the encumbrance? How are they going to be used? How transparent is the approval of the subscriber PTO? What's the explanation of use for entitlement rights versus the physical transmission for the SPTO transmission facilities? And then one of the commenters said, instead of giving them encumbrances, why don't you just give them CRRs, consistent with the merchant transmission function that is already allowed underneath our tariff. So I'd like to go, and in essence, and explain those four concepts a little bit more. So next slide, please. So as far as clarification of encumbrances, as far as rights and obligations are concerned, the transmission owner that is building the transmission line is getting subscribers to pay 100% of that line, the original cost, depreciation, O&M, A&G, everything. And in return, they're going to get, the line will be encumbered. And in the encumbrance, they'll be able to go ahead, and that's what they're selling, in essence, to their off-taker, is the right to the generation and the right to the transmission. If the funding customer is not, well, that's if the funding customer is a generator. If the funding customer is just the transmission line, then it would just be the cost of the transmission line that is included in the cost for the encumbrance that the off-taker is going to end up paying. As far as transparency for subscriber PTO decisions, the ISO has had in the transmission control agreement since, actually it was filed in 1996. I went back and looked it up. I actually have a copy of the filing, having worked for one of the companies that was very concerned about what was going on with this new ISO and PX that were going to be created. But since that time, what ends up happening is there's a whole public process. They have to provide an application by January 1 or July 1, a notice of an application, and then within 15 days, an application. The application is posted for public review. The ISO governing board has to approve it, and the project would only move forward, similar to what happened with Transwest Express, is the project is only going to move forward to the extent that the subscriber PTO gets sufficient subscribers to fully fund the transmission facilities. To the extent that they don't get subscribers to fully fund the transmission facilities, then the line will not be built. So does anybody have any questions with respect to these two items as far as clarification of encumbrances?
I'm not seeing any questions at this time. I'll let you know if anything pops up.
Okay. I was going to say, I don't see any on my side either. All right, next slide, please. So the use of, oh, wait a minute. Hold on. So the use of entitlements for subscriber PTO facilities was another question that was asked. And currently today, we do have participating transmission owners that have turned over entitlement rights in other balancing authority areas. And the ISO has operational control over those entitlement rights. Now, the facets of operational control obviously change if the transmission line is in a different balancing authority area versus if the transmission line is within the CAISO balancing authority area. But it does result in greater coordination among balancing authority areas to the extent that we do have entitlements in other BAs. And the question was asked, you know, could a subscriber PTO facility be partially an entitlement right? And in internal discussions that we've had, the ISO thinks we could make it work with part of the rights being entitlement rights, provided they're long-term rights. These rights, in essence, need to be the same time frame associated with the generator that is interconnecting or is the generator that is bringing renewable generation to California. Then there's two ways we could look at it. We could look at it as being a non-contiguous ISO balancing authority area where there's an entitlement, so it goes through another BA in between. That could be a subscriber PTO. Again, they would have to get subscribers to pay for all that. Or there's a potential the whole line could be an entitlement. We're trying to look and see what that looks like. Part of the challenges with the subscriber PTO that we put a number of places in the paper is that we're sure that there are going to be, you know, opportunities out there that we don't anticipate as part of this original development of the subscriber PTO model, and the model will need to evolve over time. So in the case where the entitlement rights will not have a scheduling priority, that's consistent with what's done today because you're in a different balancing authority area. We can't give an entitlement right scheduling priorities in a different balancing authority area. But to the extent that you are using a entitlement right in a different balancing authority area, you wouldn't pay the transmission access charge or the WAC because you're already paying the subscriber PTO for the transmission and for the congestion, similar to the way an entitlement is used. Next slide, please. And then with respect to treating subscriber rights as an encumbrance, what exactly does that mean? You know, there were a number of questions. What exactly does that get the entity who is the off-taker from the generator? And in essence, what it gives them is it gives them the perfect hedge, which means you don't pay transmission or congestion, and you get, if you're within the CAISO balancing authority area, you get a scheduling priority on the path that you've already paid for. The ISO software and tariff functionality already exists for encumbrances, so there'll be no changes to that. It will just be that subscriber rights will be now allowed to have an encumbrance. And the way that it works is you'll get a contract reference number, is what a CRN is, that will go from the point of interconnection of the generation all the way to the end of the, there'll be a P node, a pricing node at the end of the transmission that is the subscriber PTO transmission. So you'll get a contract reference number from the generation. In the case, as an example of Transwest Express, you'll get a contract reference number all the way from Wyoming down to the new substation, which is at this point believed to be intersection of the Harry Allen El Dorado line. And then from there, you would schedule your transaction in to serve your load in the LA Basin or serve your load in the CAISO balancing authority area, which is typically in the LA Basin at that point, or as an export. You could schedule it as an export if you were a entity who wanted to purchase rights from the subscriber PTO that are in Nevada or in Arizona or another balancing authority area, even LADWP. One of the comments that was made was that why aren't we just giving the subscriber PTO CRRs for the rights, as payment for the line? And what we found is that the ISO giving CRR rights has never been successful in compensating anyone to build a transmission line. And it's just never worked. So we believe that providing the subscriber the actual encumbrance rights is the way to get these lines built, and using the CRR option is just not something that is going to be practical. The other thing is that, you know, weighing this against a transmission line that the ISO would have to build all the way to Wyoming or to New Mexico or Idaho, it's going to be, you know, a cost. If we have to build the line, the cost is then included in our transmission revenue requirements, which then increases the TAC and the wheeling access charge for everybody in the grid. In this instance, having somebody else build the line and not having their transmission revenue requirements in our TAC is a benefit. So with that, I see that Katie Wells has her hand raised. Could you, Michelle, could you open up Katie's line, please?
Hi, this is Callie Wells with WPTF. I just had a couple, couple questions on this. So my first one is related to your first bullet here. So am I correct in understanding that really the only cost exposure in terms of the energy settlement for the leg on the subscriber PTO is the difference in your energy prices due to losses? Or is that also part of the perfect hedge?
No, losses are not part of the perfect hedge.
Okay, so so the only difference in your cost of energy will be due to the losses. Okay, that makes sense. Just wanted to confirm my understanding there. And my second question is, I wanted to kind of, if you don't mind, go back to your example on scheduling to serve load within the CAISO BA, just so I can make sure I understand how this would work functionally speaking. So it sounded like if you're wanting to serve load inside the CAISO BA, you'll actually submit two separate schedules. You'll have your self schedule from the source, I think you used Wyoming, to El Dorado substation, and that's linked with that CRN, so that has to be balanced. And then do they have to submit a separate bid from El Dorado substation to the LAP?
Yes.
And is there any linkage between those two schedules, or could it be the case that maybe the schedule from the substation to the LAP gets, for whatever reason, cut, and then they only have the one leg?
So the encumbrance is only for the path of the subscriber PTO. If they have a existing contract between El Dorado and the DLAP, then you'd link, in essence, two contract reference numbers together as part of your schedule. But to the extent that you don't have an existing contract and therefore not an encumbrance, then they come in just like everybody else is going to come in from El Dorado.
Okay. Okay, that makes sense. So then I'm assuming it's a similar answer if they were, instead of serving load in CAISO, they're exporting on a different intertie. You're not linking that as kind of a wheeling transaction. It's just you now have an export at a different intertie bid.
Yes, you in essence would pick up the generation at El Dorado in your example and wheel it to Palo Verde type thing.
And then export it out of Palo Verde. Okay, so unless you have a separate encumbrance for that, I'm going to call it the second leg of both of those transactions, you could end up having one leg cut if market dynamics go that way.
That is a potential yes.
Okay. Okay. I think I have it clear in my head. Thank you so much for walking me through that.
No problem. Sorry, Callie.
No worries. I get it all the time. That or Carrie.
There's lots of K's in the stakeholder realm. Operator, could you open up Bert Hansen's line?
Hansen with Southern California Edison. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can, Bert. Go ahead.
Okay, I guess I want to clarify our position on encumbrances. We expressed concern with the use of encumbrances as the means of basically operationalizing the ability of a subscriber PTO to move its power across its line. We're not proposing that the CRRs would be used as the means of funding the capital and operating costs of the line, which we understand are certainly going to be large, and would agree that the merchant PTO model would not be able to generate enough revenues. We understand that the cost of the facility would be primarily paid by subscribers, and so there really aren't any capital or operating costs to mention other than those paid by the subscriber. But what we're proposing the CRR use to be would be the way to ensure that a subscriber would be able to move the power across the subscriber PTO line and not have to pay congestion and certainly not TAC because they own or have the right to the line. So that's really our position on the CRRs. Not that they're a revenue generating means as a substitute for the subscriber contract with the SPTO, just as a means of making sure that they're able to get their power from point A to point B across the line.
Okay. Thanks, Bert. The reason why the ISO didn't incorporate that into the draft final proposal is that the use of the CRR will only get them an exemption from congestion. It will not give them, we don't have the ability to exempt them from the TAC, and we don't have the ability to give them the scheduling priority we think they deserve because they paid for the line. The only way to do that in the ISO system is by use of an encumbrance. And that's why we stayed with our original proposal and are continuing to allow the usage of the encumbrance mechanism in the tariff in order to compensate the subscriber PTO, whoever the off-takers are, for the transmission, the congestion, and giving them the scheduling priority.
Okay, I mean, it doesn't seem impossible to waive the WAC or the TAC, the WAC mainly over one specific line in a system. But I also have a question on your previous slide on the balancing authority areas as another means of implementing an SPTO line. And I'm curious if what you're saying, let's take the TWE line as an example. Would there be a transmission only balancing authority area, basically as a bubble going all the way from Wyoming to the terminus of the TWA line, both terminuses? And is that basically is that the option that the ISO would communicate with the separate BAA and the rights of the SPTO would relate to this other balancing authority area?
Not exactly. So one of the commenters had asked a question as to whether entitlement rights, well, let me step back. The original premise is that the line would be in the CAISO balancing authority area. And the question that was asked in the straw proposal is there an opportunity to go ahead and have, part of the line in a non-contiguous ISO balancing authority area with entitlement rights across a smaller portion to get to the existing CAISO balancing authority area. So when we discussed it with operations, operations is willing to consider if we have an entity that, let's say, has a 2,000-mile transmission line with generation on it, but it's not directly interconnecting into the ISO control grid, they have to get entitlement rights from another balancing authority area to get across, let's say, a 50-mile leg. Would the ISO consider that situation as a subscriber PTO model? And so what this slide is saying is that we do have existing PTOs today that have entitlement rights in other balancing authority areas. So the tariff already allows us to have existing contract rights as part of the TCA and the tariff structure. What we would want to see, though, is that if you had this, 300-mile line that's in this non-contiguous ISO-BA and anticipating the life of the line is 30 or 40 years, you'd want to see that the entitlement right is similar to the life of the transmission facilities and generation and potentially load, whatever gets built on that, first leg. You'd want to see that the entitlement rights are commensurate with the non-contiguous balancing authority area.
Okay, I think I understand. I guess I'm not quite sure why you wouldn't want such a balancing authority area to be contiguous with the ISO, and what the benefit is of having it non-contiguous.
Part of the challenge might be that they can't build that last 50 megawatts of line for one reason or another.
Okay, so then they would be taking service over existing ISO facilities for that segment.
No, they would be taking a service over non-ISO BA facilities.
Okay, then they'd have to pay a transmission wheeling rate to them, presumably.
Right. Correct.
Which of course is pancaking. I mean, would yield inefficiencies, in my opinion.
Well, in essence, it would be part of the cost that the subscribers would have to pay to get it all the way into the ISO balancing authority area.
Okay, I think I understand. Thanks.
Sure. Michelle, can you open up Doug Boccignone, fine?
Boccignone for the Bay Area Municipal Transmission Group. I think I might have misunderstood the earlier proposal, but so you're saying that the subscribers to the SPTO facility, they would pay the SPTO TAC charge or WAC charge, but would not pay the ISO TAC charge for deliveries to their load using those rights. Is that correct?
They would not pay the TAC charge or the WAC charge for use of the SPTO facilities. You got to remember that these lines are not necessarily going directly into the labs, and they're still using transmission, using Kelly Wells' example into El Dorado with Transwest Express. You're still using the ISO control grid from El Dorado into, let's say, El Dorado all the way up to the Bay Area to serve BAMX. So you still have to pay the TAC charge to serve the load in the San Francisco Bay Area.
Okay, so you pay both. You don't get exempt from the ISO, the existing ISO TAC charges, just because you've made this commitment to procure from a resource that's using the SPTO facilities. Because I think that which I think is appropriate, but I think the language in the final proposal, at least the way I read it today, I read it differently. I was reading it that you would be exempt, which doesn't seem appropriate. Because otherwise, these SPTO facilities would cost all ISO customers more money, because you would.
Right, exactly. If you could, in your comments, Doug, on the draft final, if you could point out where you think that needs to be cleared up, I'd really appreciate it.
Sure. And then it was in a same section, there was discussion about if the subscriber had procured ancillary services as part of their arrangement, then that would be part of what they would be exempt from. And I'm assuming that's the assumption there is that the supplier is somehow self-providing those ancillary services. I mean,
yes, that was the proposal that somebody had tossed out as an example. You know, how would this work?
but if they didn't have a mechanism, because it's not, I mean, the resource is going to be in the ISO BAA, right? So the ISO is going to be responsible for supporting that resource unless there's been some other arrangement made. So,
Correct.
okay. So it seems like unless that there is some other resource supporting this wind project was the example in the proposal, there wouldn't be any kind of crediting. You know, the loads would be charged for the AS requirements as they are today.
Correct.
All right, great. Thanks, Deb.
No problem. Michelle, can you open up Sushant's line? Oh.
Sushant, let me unmute you, and you should be able to go ahead.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Hi, Sushant from Clearway Energy. Hi, Deb. Yeah, first question is around the same slide 9. So does it mean a long-term point-to-point firm transmission is the same as this entitlement rights? So if there is a transmission line 1 or 2 substations away, and then there is a long-term firm point-to-point transmission to a CAISO boundary substation, then the combination of that can be an SPTO. Thanks. And the follow-up question is, in that case, if that SPTO would now be rolled into CAISO's GitApp, and similar to how it's been done here, right? So generators connecting to that remote SPTO, would they be rolled into CAISO's interconnection studies via the firm point-to-point transmission up to CAISO boundary, and how it would interplay with MIG?
So the to the extent that they're building the line to the ISO
So it's not a line up to the ISO boundary yet. It's a line somewhere a couple of substations away and paired with a firm point-to-point transmission service. But now there's more generators that want to connect there. Similar to this case where in case of Transwest, those generators are going to be in cluster 15. Would this arrangement also have the ability to allow those generators to get into CAISO's interconnection process?
So if the ISO is the non-contiguous balancing authority area and they're in the ISO balancing authority area, then the answer is yes. But in this instance, they wouldn't have deliverability per se because it's not a contiguous part of the ISO balancing authority area. You have to get across that entitlement section. And so in the entitlement
assuming
section,
they have assuming there's enough additional entitlement on that non-contiguous piece in between. They could be studied.
Assuming that there's enough MIC at that interconnection point, then yes,
Okay.
that could work.
Thanks.
Okay. All right. Michelle, could you open up Chris's line?
Hey, Deb, this is Chris Devin with Customized Energy Solutions. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Great. Actually, Sushant had the same questions that I had, so I won't, repeat everything, but that was kind of where my mind went as well. I think I certainly understand the reason why you'd want to, consider this option, but then if it's a different, non-contiguous part of the BA, I was thinking it would probably require MIC. So I guess, maybe a question or a suggestion would be if this process could then kind of, be fed into the MIC expansion process potentially, or if there wasn't enough MIC there, maybe, that could trigger an upgrade to support that additional new subscriber PTO generation or something like that. Anyhow, I think you clarified kind of the questions that I had in responding to Sushant, but I just wanted to put in that a couple extra 2 cents there. So thank you.
No problem. All right. Thanks so much, Chris. Okay.
I think that's all we have for questions, but we did have something in the chat, which I believe we already answered this, but I'll read it aloud from Lynette Kozlowski. In this example, will TAC and WAC apply to the El Dorado to Palo Verde piece?
Yes.
All right, that's all we have for questions.
Okay, great. Okay, moving on to slide 11. So in summary, with respect to encumbrances, the ISO proposal is not changing from the straw proposal. We're still intending to use existing encumbrance functionality for subscriber rights, which will provide the subscriber with scheduling priority on the transmission facilities that they paid for as part of the SPTO model, as we discussed, and will be exempted from transmission service charges and congestion on the SPTO model that they've already, in essence, paid for. So moving on to the next slide. All right, so subscriber charge. This, after we got the comments back from the straw proposal, we did end up changing this portion of our proposal. And the way that it's going to work now is that the subscriber PTO will not be allowed to include its transmission revenue requirements in the TAC or the WAC, okay? So for those of you not intimately involved in how the ISO develops the TAC and the WAC, is that for all of the participating TOs that we have, we determine what is their high voltage transmission revenue requirements, what is their low voltage transmission revenue requirements. If they are load serving entities, then we have what is their gross load for the previous regulatory period. And so we add up all the costs and then divide that cost by the gross load. And obviously some of the participating TOs, Harry Allen, El Dorado as an example, Citizens, Sycamore, Penasquito, there are Transbay Cable, there are a number of entities that are not load serving entities, but have a transmission revenue requirement. So we come up with a $1 per megawatt hour number, and that's what everybody gets charged for the TAC and the WAC. The thought is to go ahead and instead of charging at the new 3 scheduling points in the case of Transwest Express, instead of charging the subscriber wheeling charge at those 3 points, we'll go ahead and we'll charge the TAC and the WAC, which will avoid the rate pancaking issue that a number of people were concerned about. That revenue that will then be collected at those 3 points is not included in the total transmission revenue requirement used to determine the TAC to begin with, but you're getting revenue associated with these new interconnection points. So we'll have Transwest still develop their subscriber charge, and we'll be able to go ahead and, based on the imports at the scheduling points and the exports we'll know at the scheduling points, we'll be able to know what the total megawatt hours were that transferred across the subscriber PTO transmission facilities. Then, based on the subscriber charge, dollar per megawatt hour, we multiply that times the megawatt hours that are non-subscribers that use the line, and that's the total dollars that will be given to the subscriber PTO in that monthly period. And so they'll still get the revenue associated with non-subscriber usage of their facilities, but we'll go ahead and charge everyone across the entire grid the TAC and the WAC. At this point, it's highly anticipated that the dollar per megawatt hour number is going to be less than what the future TAC and WAC is going to be with all of the new builds. So it should not be an issue as far as insufficient revenue in order to pay the subscriber charge plus still cover the costs for everyone else. To the extent for some reason there is insufficient revenue, then what the tariff already has built into it is a balancing account. So to the extent that any PTO doesn't get all of the revenue that it should have gotten in a year, then there's a balancing account that goes ahead and adjusts their transmission revenue requirements for the following year. So we'll continue to use that balancing account. If the subscribers do not schedule using their rights, then in essence, the rights are available for market use. And the cost recovery for development of the subscriber charge is going to be the exact same one that every other PTO has to do, which in essence is having if you have a formula rate, you have to have a open meeting to discuss what are all the components in your formula. It has to get approved at FERC and then implemented once FERC has approved it. So all of that, if you're interested, is in Appendix F, Schedule 3, discusses all of those issues. Let me go ahead and just take on one more slide and then I'll take questions. Next slide, please. So as I said, we're trying to go ahead and revise it to avoid the rate pancaking. It will go ahead and all loads and exports will now pay the same cost. It won't be two different costs as was originally proposed. I talked about how we're going to do the imports, determination of the imports and the exports. Actually, I guess I talked through this slide without realizing this was the next slide. The other thing we will do, which was a suggestion from one of the stakeholders, is we are going to memorialize what the original build cost is to ensure that the transmission revenue requirements for the SPTO of the original build cost is never included in the ISO's transmission access charge. So with that, I see, Bert, you've got your hand up. Michelle, if you could open up Bert's line.
As Bert Hansen with Southern California Edison. At the outset, I'd comment that we're certainly in favor of reducing or eliminating rate pancaking. I'm just not sure about some of the details here. First, of course, if FERC approves a subscriber PTO wheeling charge, then that is what it is. But it's always been our understanding that there will be no cost because the costs will all have been paid by the subscriber. So at some point, we like to find out what costs are in that wheeling charge and what load is being used as the denominator to develop that wheeling access charge. Maybe that'll be in their FERC filing. The other question that I have is, what if the SPTO wheeling charge is in fact greater than the ISO wheeling access charge, and they would get paid more than the ISO WACC, and so that money comes from somewhere. And as I understand it, it comes from the TRBA, but I'm not clear exactly who will be paying the TRBA costs, because it seems like this is a loophole where the cost of the original build could be assessed to the TAC if that TRBA is not somehow not allowed to enter the TAC, which I'm not sure how that happens.
So the TAC is calculated based on the transmission revenue requirement of the participating TOs. So the subscriber PTO will not have a transmission revenue requirement in the TAC. So that's how it doesn't get into the TAC itself. As far as payment for the subscriber wheeling charge, the wheeling charge is, you can't, with open access, you can't have usage of a transmission line without payment. In the case of Transwest Express, they have subscribers from south to north, but at the moment they don't have any subscribers from north to south. So if someone wants to use the line from north to south, they should, consistent with open access and cost causation, be required to pay for that usage. It shouldn't be for free. Transmission, yes, the original subscribers have paid for it, but if somebody else is going to use the line, seems to the ISO that they should be credited some amount of money based on somebody else using the line that they completely paid for. And so that's what's going to be in the subscriber wheeling charge, only for the use by non-subscribers, and it will be used to offset the total cost that they paid as part of the original build of the transmission line.
So ultimately, the revenues would primarily flow to the subscribers.
Correct.
I guess I'm still worried about the case where the subscriber wheeling access charge is greater than the ISO wheeling access charge, which is what I understand will be assessed to exit the SPTO line. TWE, for example, somewhere up in Wyoming, you could exit up there, I think. And in that case, there's a revenue shortfall. Is that true?
I still have a hard time swallowing that the subscriber wheeling charge is greater than the TAC is for the WAC.
Okay, maybe not on TWE, but maybe there's some other example coming down the road with a different SPTO, and maybe there's a different set of circumstances. But I'm concerned that if the SPTO WAC is greater than the ISO WAC, we've got missing revenue that has to come from somebody. And it can't come from the TAC by principle. So that's our concern.
Okay. If you could include that in your comments, that would be helpful.
Okay, thanks.
Do we have any other questions on this?
No,
I'll just read out what Ryan Millard had put in the chat with respect to the termination of the subscriber encumbrance. Can you clarify what PTOs and CAISO assume for transmission facility depreciation? There was a short discussion about the depreciable lifespan of an asset in the proposal, but the statement was fairly general, so it wasn't entirely clear to me what had been established there.
Because everybody is, every transmission owner that I know in the ISO calculates all of their original build costs differently. Their depreciation schedules are different. Life of facility is different, et cetera. What we're agreeing to is that we would go ahead and memorialize what the original build cost is to ensure that that cost is not included as part of the transmission revenue requirement. So it's not a set formula way of doing things.
And then, oh, Ryan put his hand up, so maybe he wants to just clarify and have a follow-up.
That would be helpful. Go ahead, Ryan.
Ryan, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Ryan from NextEra Energy Resources. I think you're getting to my question, but more specifically around the years. There was I think 30 plus years was thrown out there. So I wasn't sure if you were establishing a time frame for those assets in terms of depreciation. That's where I wasn't clear.
Typically, I believe it's FERC requires a minimum of 30 years for transmission life of transmission lines. Some people use 30, some people use 40. I haven't seen anyone that goes over 40 for the life of the transmission line. That's why I tossed out 30.
Thank you.
We did have another question in the chat come in from Chris Barker. For congestion revenue that is collected for use by non-subscribers, where is that revenue allocated? Is it similar to the principles established by the EDAM, where the congestion revenues are provided to the entities that provided the available transmission capacity?
No. The CRR revenue, consistent with today, the way the ISO does the CRR revenue goes to the entity that purchased the CRR through the auction. The ISO is not planning on changing the CRR, at least not that I've heard anyways, not planning on changing the CRR construct that we currently have in place for the CAISO Balancing Authority area. If anybody knows better than I do, John, maybe you could help on that.
No, Deb, you're correct. I have not heard any suggestion that we would do anything other than credit the congestion revenues back to the existing CRR mechanism.
And then Chris Devon raised his hand. So Chris, if you wanted to go ahead and answer your question or ask your question.
Michelle, can you unmute Chris?
Hey there, can you hear me now?
Yep.
Yeah, just on that CRR question, I was just curious as to, I wasn't totally clear in the written proposal about the ability for like a non-subscriber to get a CRR along these subscriber PTO pathways. Has that been contemplated at all? And is that a potential possibility?
So what ends up happening when they do the CRR model, putting my old market services hat on from a decade or two ago, it ends up that the CRR model goes ahead and takes out all of the encumbrances from the transmission lines that we already have. So there will be no CRRs from, in essence, north to south, but there will be CRRs south to north. And the reason is because it's fully encumbered, Transwest Express anyways, is fully encumbered from Wyoming all the way down to the loop in of the Harry Allen El Dorado line. But there will be CRRs going the other direction.
Okay, that makes sense. And then there would still be CRRs that people would want to get maybe from that offtake point at Harry Allen to their, ELAP or wherever, kind of going back to Callie's question originally, probably to kind of facilitate maybe that hedging against the congestion exposure, because there could be a lot of, energy injections at that point.
Right.
Got it. Okay, that helps. I understand it now. Thank you.
Sure. And Callie just raised her hand.
Yeah, hi, it's Callie Wells with WPTF again. Actually, to follow up on Chris's question on the CR. So if CRRs are available from like the Harry Allen El Dorado back up the line, so kind of in the counterflow direction, wouldn't the CRR model then allow counterflow of CRRs in the opposite direction? So could there actually be CRRs awarded from, let's just say, Wyoming down to El Dorado?
No, because the the CRR model takes out all of the encumbrances that still exist on the ISO control grid.
Sure, because I know it also allows the counterflow, so I wasn't sure if that counterflow would provide for that. But okay, thank you.
All right. Moving on. Next slide, please. So what are the subscriber rights and obligations? In essence, the subscriber has already paid for the transmission, energy, and congestion on the project. The subscriber is going to be paying the tax to get it to sync into load, because there's no load interconnected to the subscriber PTO facilities. Now, if there were load interconnected to the subscriber PTO facilities, and that's where the load was being synced, then it wouldn't pay the TAC at all. Or if it was going to go ahead and exit on the subscriber PTO facilities, then it wouldn't pay the WAC at all. But if you're going ahead and exporting at a point that is not on the project, the subscriber PTO project, you would end up paying the WAC. The subscriber will receive the perfect hedge and get the scheduling priority, and consistent with all encumbrances, they'll be excluded from the bid cost recovery allocation, the offsets, and the day-ahead congestion allocation. And the reason for that is because the encumbrances do not create any of those cost items or charge codes, and that's why they're exempted from them. Next slide, please. So as far as non-subscriber rights are concerned, non-subscribers would be scheduling on the subscriber PTO, will still pay the tax to avoid the rate pancaking, and you'll pay to the extent they're exiting from the grid, they'll pay the WAC, and the non-subscribers will pay all the other applicable charges. So they will pay the congestion charges, they will pay the offset charges, they'll pay all charges associated with their transaction. We have a question from Bert.
Hi, Bert Hansen, Southern California Edison. I guess I want to clarify the statement that paying the TAC if the generation is synced to load in the ISO balancing authority area. Of course, everybody with load in the ISO balancing authority area is paying the TAC through their retail rates. And I just want to say that what I think you mean is that load is paying the TAC just like they were before, and it's not a function of where the generation came from. Is that your
I would agree
perspective
with
on
that.
that? Okay.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Thank you.
Okay. Chris?
Chris Devin with Customized Energy Solutions again. One more bite at the apple on this for me, Deb, and I'll stop bugging you guys about it. But I guess just going back to the last slide for me real quick, I just kind of just want to make one more point about this whole, you know, kind of uplift and other congestion costs and other things associated with these, you know, use of these encumbrances. And I think some of the other stakeholder comments I saw, you know, touched on this a little bit. But I guess, you know, just to me, just theoretically, it seems like they are maybe causing some other costs or uplifts or offsets when they exercise these potential rights. I know that they're not, you know, directly causing that due to the you know, the way that the encumbrances are calculated and backed out in the traditional CAISO settlement process. But I just think from kind of a cost causation standpoint, it seems like there might be some reason to maybe, you know, take a look at how those things impact the other potential flows on these, you know, on these kind of facilities, and then, you know, maybe use some of that subscriber WAC charge or tax charge, you know, to maybe offset some of that or something. I think some folks had mentioned that. I think SCE mentioned that. I don't want to speak for them, but, you know, I guess all I'll say is I still kind of feel that way, but I can understand the position of CAISO in this because of the fact that I think that's pretty complicated to try to do something like that. So maybe it's just a little bit more straightforward to just continue down this pathway where, you know, we're not worrying about any of that stuff. But it just kind of goes, the kind of, you know, principal point I want to make here is that it kind of goes away from using market-based price signals to just use these encumbrances in this manner. And so in that sense, you know, it's kind of just a different approach to provision of transmission service. And so, you know, that has me, you know, maybe a little bit concerned that it's going to become a model where more people are trying to maybe get away from being exposed to some of the market risks and market signals that get created from the use of the transmission system in a more traditional sense under the market. So anyhow, that's my you know, soapbox, and I won't keep going on anymore. But you know, I just wanted to have that be heard, and I appreciate you guys hearing me out on it. Thank you.
No problem. So I had a very in-depth discussion with James Lynn on this, and in essence, the reason why settlements came out with allowing these three items to be excluded is that because they are, in order for them to have an encumbrance, they have to have a balanced schedule. So what starts goes to the end. There's no big cost recovery allowed for a balanced schedule. There are no offsets because the balanced schedule requires them to be balanced, and so therefore they don't have a different number at point A versus point B, and they don't pay for congestion. So that's why they're not allocated the day-ahead market congestion. So that's why the whole balance schedule is what resulted in them being exempted from these charges. So there is a method to the madness. Did you want to say something else, Chris?
Yeah, sorry, I went on mute again, but I guess I'll just take the opportunity to say thanks for the explanation. And I can kind of understand the more specifics when you're pointing out just those examples and you know, how the settlements process works. And some of my, you know, concerns on this have been a little bit theoretical as far as just, you know, what happens between different timeframes and you know, what happens if they exercise their rights, you know, maybe not in the day ahead and then into real time, and what are those price formation impacts, you know, maybe, you know, potentially cause some other uplifts that maybe that's a little bit more complex than kind of just this more straightforward piece of this. But so I certainly point well taken, and I think on straightforward things I can understand the position on it for sure. And you know, maybe it's just something just to be aware of and kind of monitor and see how much this maybe you know, has any impacts in the future. If we could do some analysis on it as you start get experience with the use of these encumbrances and that sort of thing, that might be helpful just to flag that in the future for something to look at. But anyways, I appreciate the response. Thank you very much.
Okay. And we have had encumbrances for about 26 years now, so, and if it is in real time, then it is allocated to them. It's only the IFM congestion allocation that's not allocated to them. So let's go ahead and move on. Michelle, could you go to the next slide, please? The next slide. There we go. Okay. So network upgrades beyond the original build. So if the subscriber PTO gets the subscribers, builds the line, and somebody else wants to interconnect to the line in the future, then the future upgrades or expansions that were over and above what the original build was will be allowed to be recovered through the ISO's access charge. The subscriber PTO would develop a cost of service similar to what the other PTOs do and would be reimbursed consistent with the tariff, including, FERC approval for their rate and adding it into the transmission revenue requirement. And this is over and above any transmission that is built as part of the original build. So that's why we're going to memorialize what the original build cost is to ensure that we're not allowing other costs to sneak in the future. Next slide, please. For termination of the subscriber encumbrances, so from the perspective of the proposal, regardless of the term, if it's a 5-year term, 10-year term, whatever term, the subscriber PTO puts on their contracts with their subscriber, that's nice, but the original build cost that has been memorialized can never be put into the transmission revenue requirement for the TAC or the WAC. That full cost, they'll have to get additional subscribers in order to go ahead and pay for those costs. Those costs will not be recovered through us. And the stakeholders strongly support that position, and so does the ISO. However, once the original project has been completely paid off, 30 or 40 years down the road, what we're willing to put into the discussion at this point is the determination of continuing the encumbrance or not will be based on the applicable regulatory requirements at that time. I mean, if I just look back and see how the industry has changed the last 30 years, and yes, I've been in it more than 30 years, what's changed in the last 30 versus how it's going to change in the next 30, there's no way that we could come up with a set prescription as to what happens to the encumbrance 30 years down the road from now. So with that, that's all about encumbrances, and I'm going to go on to generator interconnection process next. So does anybody have any questions on the encumbrance issue, the new transmission costs, the transmission allocation, how any of that works? Yes, Chris Barker. Go ahead, Chris.
To my chat just to make sure I have this understood, because I heard two things. One, the congestion there will be no CRRs available for north to south capacity that's made available based on unscheduled capacity because of the encumbrances. Do I have that right? I think I heard that right.
Yeah, well, CRRs are based on a CRR model that goes ahead and takes out all of the transmission rights associated with existing contracts.
Right. So there would be no non-subscriber that would have the ability to clear an auction for CRRs for north to south capacity. Is that
Correct.
okay?
Correct.
So does that mean that the nodal price for the north to south pricing up in the northern terminus and the southern terminus would not include congestion? The congestion components
No,
of the LMP?
The LMP will include congestion.
Okay, so for the revenue that is generated through the congestion component of the LMP for use for non-subscriber, where does that revenue go? If there are no holders of the CRRs for that portion of the facility.
To be frank with you, am not up to speed on the CRRs. I haven't done that since the mid-'80s. It was a job in the mid-'80s, but I haven't done that since mid-'90s. But I believe what ends up happening with the CRRs is that there is an allocation given to the CRR holders, and if there is excess money or insufficient money, then it goes into a bucket that is then provided. I think it goes to all of the scheduling coordinators, but don't hold me to that. John or Riddy, do you have a better idea of how the excess revenue of a CRR is allocated?
Yeah. And that's why I referenced kind of the EDAM model, because my understanding is that the congestion revenue that gets generated under that structure goes to the EDAM entity that provided the transmission, which makes sense for them to be allocated that because they made that available. And then it's up to kind of their OAT to how they distribute that. Under kind of a transmission only or a generation only SPTO model, there is no like inherent load that would where that would be allocated. And so it would be our understanding that kind of following those similar principles, if there are no CRRs holders to pay out, then that incremental revenue generated through congestion by use of non-subscribers would stay to the PTO or the SPTO that made that capacity available. So that's the clarification I was looking for.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, yeah, and I don't have a specific answer, although I would say that it's the same answer, and that the revenue, any additional revenues from the north to south congestion would flow back into the normal CAISO CRR process, which is the same for the CAISO BAA under the EDAM proposal. Congestion revenues for ITC constraints and other congestion associated with transfers would flow to the ISO and into the ISO's CRR process. But I do hear what you're saying. If there's no CRRs for that segment, how does that work? And I think we should follow up with a better explanation of the mechanics of that. And if there is a gap or void, we can propose something on how to resolve that. But yeah, that's my understanding, if that helps.
Yeah, because Chris, today we still have about 60 existing contracts across the ISO balancing authority area. And that revenue associated with the CRRs does not go back to the PTOs in the CAISO BAA.
Okay. Where does it go?
It goes to the scheduling coordinators.
That's scheduled across those facilities?
No, not necessarily. It goes into a bucket, and then my recollection is it goes into a bucket, and then it is spread across all of the scheduling coordinators. Okay.
Yeah, I probably have some additional follow-up questions because I don't know that fully kind of ties off for me, but yeah, let me see if we can kind of formulate a follow-up question. I appreciate the responses.
Yeah, that'd be great. If you could include those in your questions in your comments, that'd be helpful. Okay, Michelle, could you open up Bert's line?
Hi, Bert Hanson, Southern California Edison. I'm not sure where this question fits in, but could you explain if there's a schedule change by a subscriber from, let's say, day ahead or hour ahead to real time, and that change causes redispatch and incurs costs? Would those costs, let's say they're in the ISO balancing authority area, somewhere in the middle, redispatch costs, are those costs allocated back to the subscribers?
The redispatch costs are allocated across all of the entities that are modifying their schedules. So it's not just the subscriber that is singled out to pay for all of the changes in the real-time market.
Does the fact that they have their own CAC area insulate them in any way from being responsible for redispatch costs?
Not for the energy and allocation. The TAC area gives them help from the unaccounted for energy.
Okay, so basically redispatch costs are shared among, not just, if you could attribute it to somebody, it's not just attributed to somebody, it's shared among all the responsible schedule change entities.
Right.
Okay, thanks.
Sure. Okay. All right, next slide, please, Michelle. All right, so the generator interconnection, we had originally posed a question to get what people's thoughts were with respect to recovering the subscriber PTO if they have to develop network upgrades for their systems. Should they go ahead and pay the cost back to the subscriber? So FERC came out with an order associated with affected systems. So let me back up. Today, if a generator is interconnecting in the ISO balancing authority area, that generator upfront finances all of the network upgrades required for the project. And then once they come online, the participating TOs have to pay them back over a 5-year period. What was currently sitting before FERC when we asked the question was if an affected system, so somebody who builds a generator in Nevada, impacts a transmission owner in the ISO and it causes the transmission owner in the ISO to upgrade their facility due to flows in the ISO balancing authority area, does that transmission owner have to reimburse the generator that is in the affected system? And FERC came back and said, yes, the cost, even though the generator is not in the ISOBA, the network upgrade is in the ISOBA, and therefore the participating TO will have to pay back that generator who upfront financed the upgrade for the transmission that's in the ISOBA. So that's consistent with what existing PTOs today. The subscriber PTO will not develop a transmission revenue requirement, I think, as I've said probably 6 times now, for the original build. But to the extent as a affected system they have to build a network upgrade associated with a generator interconnection either within the CAISO BA or due to their being affected by a generator, then they would get transmission revenue requirements applied. They could apply for transmission revenue, develop a transmission revenue requirement, and apply for cost recovery underneath the TAC. FERC came out with that afterwards, and we can't be inconsistent with what FERC has already ordered us to do. But we are not going to go ahead and allow them to recover any of the original builds from their project. So that we're staying pat on. Next slide, please. So with respect to the transmission planning process, it's the same transmission planning process that we've always had. The MIC at the new, there will be market import capability at the new import points for the ISO. As an example, for Transwest Express, the existing import points MIC allocation is at El Dorado and Harry Allen. With the new Transwest Express, you'll have an import point at TWE Crystal, another one at Utah, another one at Ferris. And so with those three new import points, what ends up happening is we will now have MIC allocations available at those import points. The MIC allocation, just to remind everybody, is allocated to load serving entities. It's not allocated to generators, and it's anticipated. What ends up happening is it's an expansion. So if you already have a MIC allocation at El Dorado or Harry Allen, that MIC allocation won't change. The MIC allocation is expanded because we now have this additional transmission line that has come in. If the, as we discussed a little bit earlier, if the subscriber PTO generation is within the ISO BA, it does not use MIC. But if the subscriber PTO generation is not contiguous with the existing ISO BA, then it would need MIC in order to get into the ISO. And I see we have a question from Jeff Nelson. Go ahead, Jeff.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Oh, sorry. Thanks. Good afternoon, Jeff Nelson, FC. Debbie, if we could loop back on generator interconnection driven, like network upgrade driven costs. So I want to focus on Transwest Express. So Transwest Express has the line plus, I forget what the number is, 3,000 megawatts of wind. And the 3,000 megawatts of wind has not been studied in the interconnection process yet.
Correct.
When it is studied, let's just assume that there are certain network upgrade costs associated with that initial 3,000 megawatts of wind.
Okay.
How are those costs recovered and by whom?
They're recovered by the subscriber.
Okay, so those initial upgrade costs are covered by the subscriber. And so what you were saying is, like, let's say down the road, another 1,000 megawatts of wind wants to interconnect in the future. And then they go through the interconnection process and there's network upgrade costs for this additional wind. That's where you're saying TRR will be developed for those future upgrade costs.
Correct.
Okay, thank you for clarifying. Appreciate it. Thank you.
No problem. Okay. All right, next slide, please. So just a summary of the draft final proposal. The ISO proposes to go ahead and provide encumbrance rights to the subscriber PTO so that in the agreements with their subscribers, They will have encumbrances available to them to hedge for the perfect hedge for both congestion and for the transmission cost, along with priority rights on the transmission lines that they've already paid for. The ISO will charge all load the TAC and all exports the WAC to avoid the rate pancaking. The cost for the original build of the subscriber PTO transmission facilities will not be included in the ISO transmission revenue requirement. The subscriber PTO will be paid the use of the line by non-subscribers through a FERC-approved subscriber wheeling charge. There's too many S's in that sentence. If the subscriber encumbrance is terminated prior to the recovery of the original build cost, the subscriber PTO cannot include any such cost in the ISO transmission revenue requirements. And then next slide, continuing on with the summary. Michelle, next slide, please. Thank you. Future interconnections to the subscriber PTO transmission facilities will be treated in accordance with the ISO tariff. So the generator interconnection process and the PTO will be able to develop a TRR that will be included in the ISO's access charge. MIC will be allocated to the new scheduling points, and the current MIC allocation has priority over the new MIC allocation or MIC expansion. And in order for the applicant PTO to bridge the gap between going through and having their interconnection transmission interconnection studied, and then the study for the generator interconnection, the ISO will put in place a applicant PTO agreement to bridge that gap, which is what we do with all of our competitive solicitation projects, as far as between when we award the competitive solicitation and they actually turn over operational control as part of the execution of the transmission control agreement. That's how we bridge that time. And John, you wanted to comment on something? John Anders?
Yeah, Deb. Yeah. So I just wanted to, point out or note in the CPP at least, Deb, the draft transmission plan. Maybe you want to, expand on it a little bit, but it's not directly related, but it is relevant in the sense that the ISO identified, considerable network upgrades to access out-of-state, wind resources in Idaho and Wyoming, and I think New Mexico and offshore wind and other places and all that. And so that could address some of the deliverability issues for the out-of-state wind resources. So that was all I was going to make note of.
Good point. Thanks. Okay, I see we've got Doug Boccignoni first for a question.
Doug Boccignoni for BAMX. I just wanted to follow up on Jeff Nelson's question and then the comment John Anders just made. So you said that if there's network upgrades that are triggered by this subscriber, the subscriber responsible for the cost, but those would not be eligible for reimbursement. Is that right?
Correct. For the original build.
For the original build.
Yeah, if it's not part of the transmission planning process, and that's what John Anders was just bringing up, that in the transmission planning process, there's a number of network upgrades that will be approved in hopefully May. Those network upgrades are not going to be allocated to, as an example, the upgrades going in at El Dorado will not be allocated to Transwest Express because that's part of the transmission planning process. It's the intent was the subscriber PTO pays for the transmission facilities that are needed that are not approved by the transmission planning process. I guess is the better way to say it.
So if there are the projects that are being studied as part of Cluster 15, for example, that are related to Transwest Express, if those trigger the need for network upgrades, those would not be reimbursable. But if the projects that get approved in the TPP sort of obviate the need for some upgrades because they can accommodate the out-of-state resources, then those costs are going to be borne by CAISO, the parties who pay the CAISO TAC.
Correct.
Okay, so it's a little bit of a timing issue.
Right. Michelle, can you open up Mike Florio's line?
I have a question regarding MIC. And I mean, there's a certain amount of MIC available at El Dorado, at Harry Allen today. And I'm trying to figure out what happens in a situation where, say, Transwest Express comes online in, say, 2028, and the TPP upgrades from that area into the load center don't come online for, say, 5 years after that. It seems like there's more MIC potentially available than there is transmission to bring in the supply, because you've got a certain amount of MIC now that's subscribed to various people, and you bring in Transwest Express and they get new MIC available, but the transmission downstream hasn't changed yet. Do you understand what I'm talking about?
Right. So it's the transmission that's being built in the TPP is both reliability transmission and deliverability transmission.
Right.
So Transwest Express could not interconnect until the transmission associated with all the reliability network upgrades has been built.
Yeah.
It's just the delivery network upgrades, they could come on before that, but they wouldn't have the deliverability. They wouldn't be able to have the deliverability all the way into the load.
Okay.
That's how we do all of the network upgrades today.
Okay.
So they get a potential, there's a potential for interim deliverability, but they don't get PCDS, partial capacity deliverability status, or full capacity deliverability status until all of the delivery network upgrades have been completed.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Michelle, could you open Steve Greenleaf's line?
Hi, Deb. Can you hear me?
I can.
Yeah. Hi. How are you?
Good.
Good. Steve Greenleaf with Brookfield. I'm going back to Doug's follow-up on Jeff's question. I just want to make sure I understand where you've landed. So under the proposal, and set aside, I understand all the policy projects being approved in the TPP may very well address a lot of the deliverability issues in that area, but set that aside for a second, or pretend they're not, they don't, you know, they're not moving forward. Where you are with the proposal right now, Transwest, or more, I think specifically, Power Company of Wyoming, would not, are you saying they would not be subject to the existing CAISO tariff policy on credit back if upgrades are needed on the ISO system? They would have to pay for those upgrades, but wouldn't be credited back by the PTO?
If they were required for the original build, the thought was to go ahead and not credit. Hold on.
And yeah, and I'm talking about network upgrades required on the CAISO system. Let's assume, you know, in the SCE area in Southern California somewhere, you know, completely distinct and separate from the line, the Transwest Express line from Wyoming to Harry Allen. So delivery upgrades needed beyond that on the ISO system. Originally, I know in the, you know, early in this process, you said originally Transwest was going to pay for all those if needed. Then I thought the ISO kind of went back and said, no, it's going to be subject to the existing policy. So I'm just trying to figure out where this proposal landed. Did it go back to the original, or?
No. So where FERC came out, I mean, think of it this way. If Transwest Express or a subscriber PTO were a gen-only balancing authority area and not part of the ISO, their Edison would be an affected system associated with the interconnection of the generation coming down the Transwest Express line. And so FERC came out with an order that said, oh, no, even though the generator is not in the CAISO balancing authority area and it's in an affected PTO, the Edison would still have to reimburse the generator for the upfront financing of the transmission that is being built by Edison within the CAISO BA for, in the case of reliability upgrades that are required.
Right, and I understand all that, and that is kind of a one-off, but I understand you got to address it in the context of the larger subscriber PTO model. But in the context of Transwest Express, which is going to be part of the ISO BA, right? Right. So it's within the BA. It's paid. You know, the subscriber will pay for the line from Wyoming to Harry Allen, and you know, whatever. But as that 3,000 megawatts, or however it's phased in, of generation up in Wyoming is going to be studied in the generator interconnection, to the extent network upgrades, area network upgrades, however you want to classify them, are needed on the CAISO system beyond Harry Allen, you know, somewhere between Harry Allen and the load centers, that will be subject, though the cost of those upgrades initially will have to be funded by the generation of Wyoming, but then will still be subject to the credit back.
Yes.
The 5-year payback.
Yes.
Under existing policy. Okay.
Yes.
All right.
It's the
And
cost.
then, go ahead.
It's the cost between Wyoming and the Harry Allen El Dorado line that will not be paid back.
Absolutely, right. The
Okay.
transmission line costs. That's paid by
Right.
the subscribers.
Correct.
Yeah. Okay. All right. I thought I heard a different response in the initial, Jeff's initial question, but maybe I misunderstood that. And then with Doug's follow up. So anyway, okay. So they will be, and well, I don't know if hopefully, but setting that aside, obviously all the policy projects that are in the proposed TPP could largely address a lot of the deliverability issues on their own anyway. But
yeah,
okay. All right. Thank you. That's
no
all
problem.
the clarification I wanted.
Yeah. Michelle, could you open up Chris Barker's line, please?
Hi, Deb. Chris Barker again from Clearway.
Yep.
More questions on the same theme. So I have two main questions with regards to kind of MIC and deliverability allocation to resources interconnecting into the SPTO facilities. So we'll start there. So you mentioned that MIC will be added to new import points. Are you suggesting that incremental MIC will be added to be allocated to those resources through the GetApp process, and that those resources would then be granted a deliverability status if they were eligible for that allocation, and that incremental capacity would be kind of discounted from the OTC in the similar way that you kind of get down to what your MIC is available for allocation to the load?
I think you mixed up apples and oranges.
Well, I think that there are apples and oranges here that I'm trying to make sure it's clear.
So the market import capability is determined by the transmission planners, and it's allocated to load.
Yep.
As part of the GetApp process, the TPD, transmission planning deliverability, is allocated to the project based on the deliverability capability studied in the GetApp process. And
Right.
that is allocated to the generator.
Yeah, I'm fully aware of that kind of determination. That's kind of where I want to dive in a little bit to understand how incremental capacity or how the current MIC at El Dorado will be evaluated when new resources are seeking interconnection and deliverability through the GetApp process across the SPTO. So are we to assume then that new resources would seek deliverability based on what is available, consistent of like prioritization of existing MIC to load today? And then what is, sorry, I see you shaking your head, so help me out here.
Sure. So the Power Company of Wyoming is in the CAISO BA. So it does not have a MIC allocation. It doesn't need a MIC allocation. It is going to get TPD when it gets its deliverability. There will be MIC import capability at, in essence, between Wyoming and Ferris. There'll be a new MIC import capability at TWE Crystal and at Utah, which are the substations along the way before you get to the Harry Allen El Dorado line. So there'll be MIC at the other places. Now the MIC at El Dorado and the MIC at Harry Allen today have a priority over the MIC allocation that will ultimately be determined for the Wyoming Ferris point, the Utah point, and the TWE Crystal point.
Okay. So maybe I think that all sticks together. So let me ask my second question with regards to kind of the non-contiguous balancing authorities under this SPTO model. So I think what we talked about earlier was that if you had an encumbrance that kind of bridges between the SPTO BA and the CAISO BA, that allows those resources to seek interconnection into the CAISO. My question is, so long, and they can effectively, I would imagine, be deliverable for the amount of capacity that for which they have encumbrances across that non-contiguous transmission component. Would those resources still in the non-contiguous BA still have like the same deliverability that like the Transwest resources would have because they have the transmission? No, okay.
No, they'd have to get mixed in order to get across that leg that is only an entitlement.
Okay. So it kind of breaks this concept of kind of within, like, how, as you were describing resources on Transwest as quote unquote in CAISO's BA, therefore they get deliverability and not MIC, which is why I was asking these apples and oranges questions, because it seems to challenge that notion. And I'm left wondering, you know, the SPTO model in my mind was at an advantage to what is otherwise available. If you have firm transmission, you'd be pseudo tied into the BA because you're given kind of this firm deliverability allocation through the GetApp process. But as soon as you kind of break the bubbles apart, you know, that you then now need to go through the MIC allocation process for delivering those resources. And how, maybe taking that one step further, how would the CAISO evaluate new resources that are seeking to interconnect into the non-contiguous balancing area under the SPTO model if those new resources don't have the incumbent, like don't have incumbent capacity? Would that interconnection request not be deemed valid until you show up with incremental incumbent like capacity to get into the boundaries of the existing California ISOBA?
Yeah, they'd need to get their own mix.
Okay. Even to file an interconnection request to be evaluated?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, these are interesting details that I think because I think the first time that we saw this concept was in the TPP, where it was referencing another transmission project that didn't quite make it to the existing boundary. And being eligible to go through the GetApp offers a lot of these questions, or generates a lot of these questions. And so maybe we'll file some comments to see if we can get some clarification there on kind of the process, but I appreciate that.
Okay, great. All right. Michelle, could you open Bert Hansen's line, please?
Hi, Bert Hansen, Southern California Edison. I think I ended up being a little confused on network upgrade costs. So with respect to the original build, you are saying that those costs will not be paid for by the SPTO or the SPTO subscribers, but instead will be paid for by through the TAC, basically.
So what the discussion I had with breaking apart the two different parts, okay? So if because of the existing transmission plan, there are network upgrades already included in the transmission plan for Edison to expand the capabilities of their transmission facilities coming out of El Dorado into the LA Basin. And when Transwest Express, Power Company of Wyoming, capacity is studied in order, part of the generator interconnection process, and the upgrades on Edison's system are already incorporated in the TPP, they wouldn't have to pay for those upgrades because they're already incorporated into the base case. What they would pay for is from Wyoming all the way down to the Harry Allen El Dorado line, which is the new facilities that they would be paying for. So I think that's where we got tripped up. I was thinking of the question of only being the Wyoming facilities down to the Harry Allen El Dorado line and not all the way into the basin underneath the TPP that's currently draft and going to go before the board in May.
Okay, so they could pay for upgrades in Southern California, and if it wasn't already approved in the TPP, and not be refunded?
If it wasn't already approved in the TPP, because of the FERC order that just came out, Edison would still have to refund them the cost of the upgrades.
Okay, and if it's not in the TPP and the original build does cause upgrades, though, then it is ultimately paid for by SPTO, TWE, whoever. Did I get that right?
Say that again. What's
the upgrade was not in a TPP.
Yep.
The SPTO causes upgrades with the original build. Then under that scenario, those costs are the responsibility of the SPTO and would not be eligible for credits?
That's not what the FERC order came out with. What the FERC order said was that any network upgrades required by generation outside of the ISO balancing authority area still needs to be reimbursed by the participating TOs within the CAISO BA. So consistent with that, then any upgrades that would have to be built for an SPTO coming in within our existing balancing authority area would then be cost recovery would be from the participating transmission owner that has to upgrade their system to meet the needs.
Is there a distinction between the existing ISO BAA and the future larger BAA, including SPTO, TWE, which to me seems like it's one big BAA at that point, or even now for the study purposes?
It is one big BAA. For Transwest Express, it is one big BAA. But when FERC came out and said, even for affected systems, we have to reimburse the generator for the cost of the transmission that's being built within the CAISO BA, then we couldn't then charge Transwest Express because that would be inconsistent with the FERC order we just received.
Is the FERC order applicable in this case as because it seems like it's may not apply since it's one big BAA?
Well, it's to the, yes, it is one big BAA, but if they had gone ahead and what they were originally going to do is be a gen-only BAA, then they become an affected system and then it applies to them. So if it were going to apply to them, then it should be consistently applied whether they are in the CAISO BA or not in the CAISO BA.
Okay, I think I'm going to have to study my recorders here. But thank you.
Sure.
Yeah, Deb, this is John. I would just, that last point you just made, or the way you said it, it's that the FERC order reinforces the recovery mechanism that would exist if they were in the ISO BAA, because it would apply the same either way. So I mean, I agree with everything you've been saying. So yeah.
Okay.
No different for a, yeah.
Yeah, do you remember the FERC docket for that? Somebody's asking for a citation in the chat.
No, I was not the the attorney on that. It was relatively recent. Wasn't it?
I think it's on March. I don't know if I have it in the paper.
And it was in response to a FERC, or a CAISO filing, so it should be on our website. I can look it up.
How about, it's FERC docket ER 23491. Let me just, ER 23-941. It's in the paper on page 20, for those of you that have a copy of the paper handy. Okay. Michelle, could you open up Steve Greenleaf's line, please?
Thanks, Deb. Steve Greenleaf, Brookfield. I think everything you just told Bert confirms what you told me, so, which is good.
Oh, good.
I just think this whole this recent FERC order really is just an expansion, in my view, of the kind of existing CAISO policy on crediting of network upgrades. It's really not applicable in the specific Transwest case because they are proposed to be part of the BAA. So they're not an affected system. Or the CAISO is not an affected system due to their interconnection because they're part of the BA. But I understand that under other subscriber PTO models where they're not part of the the BA, or they're a non-contiguous part, it could be applicable. So anyway, my question goes, and this is just, I think, my old brain being tired, but I'm going back to, they're in the BA, or Power Company of Wyoming and Transwest are part of the BA. You said they don't, because they're in the BA, they don't have to worry about MIC.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm just going back to kind of, and maybe this is mixing the apples and the oranges again. So there's one thing from a kind of MIC deliverability perspective. There's another from a scheduling perspective. And there's still scheduling. Obviously, they're using their line from Wyoming to Harry Allen. At Harry Allen is still, it's still an intertie point, even though it's Power Company of Wyoming Generation and Transwest are part of the BA. So they still need to schedule. This kind of goes back to Callie's question earlier in the call. They're still, when they're scheduling in at Harry Allen, they're competing with everybody else at that intertie point, right? To the market.
Well,
for
the Transwest Express line is not going to Harry Allen.
Well, okay, wherever it's going. It's going, okay. It's going to that new intertie point between Harry Allen and El Dorado.
Right.
Okay. Okay. And so, but when you said it didn't, they don't have to worry about MIC. I thought you said that.
Yes, I did.
Why not? Because they're getting to that new intertie point, but then they're coming into the ISO system, the existing ISO system, where? At Harry Allen or El Dorado?
No, they're coming, so Public Company of Wyoming is within the CAISO Balancing Authority area. The Balancing Authority area is now going to stretch all the way to Wyoming.
Right.
Okay, so they're completely within the CAISO Balancing Authority area. So there's no market import capability because there's no import.
Okay. I mean,
It's generation within the Balancing Authority area.
okay. And so on a day-to-day basis, from a scheduling perspective, they would be just scheduling in up in Wyoming
Right.
for ultimate delivery to just whatever, a lap.
Load. Yeah.
Yeah. So there's no, okay, I'm just trying to reconcile that with what I thought you told Callie earlier about scheduling in on a day-to-day basis.
So the discussion Callie and I had was that they only get the perfect hedge and the priority rights for scheduling, and they don't have to pay for congestion for the leg from Wyoming to the Harry Allen El Dorado interconnection. After that, they're going to have to pay for the congestion cost to get it across from the Harry Allen El Dorado point to wherever they're syncing the generation, whether it's a default lap, a custom lap, or an export. They're going to have they get scheduling priority. They don't get any cost waived, all those things.
Okay. Okay. I'll continue to think through it. So it's really just, you were specifically just talking to those cost elements from Harry Allen, whatever, into the load centers, into the laps. Yeah.
Right.
Okay. All right.
Okay.
Thank you.
We've kind of gone over. Let me go ahead and take the next slide, please. Okay, so the conference call is obviously today. Comments are due May 2nd, and then we're looking to publish the final proposal and the draft tariff language by May 15th. Next slide, please. So for the next steps, please go ahead and submit your comments on the status update meeting discussion using the commenting tool on our website by the end of the day on May 2nd. And Caitlin has included the link for you there. She's also included the web page for the subscriber PTO model. And if you have any questions, please contact ISO Stakeholder Affairs at CAISO.com. And with that, I think we'll go ahead and end our call.
Thank you for your participation, everybody. Have a great rest of your day.
That concludes our conference. Thank you for using Event Services. You may now disconnect.